Good morning, Chairman, or afternoon, whatever time zone you're on. We're all, I guess some of us are on different time zones. Some of us are on the same time zone.
Correct.
Welcome back. Another week of tone in the route to Tone Town. And episode 26 today, we have, I think, a special episode that I think has vexed many people. And it's terms and vocabulary that are frequently used in the music, guitar, gear industry that often there's not a lot of clarity on. There's not a lookup table or an index where you can go and look up what terms like true bypass, buffered bypass, current, voltage, impedance, polarity, phase, EQ, mono, stereo. There's not a place where you can go and just look up those terms and have clear, concise answers that are provided by industry professionals. And so today what we're hoping to do is actually give you an audio or visual lookup table, depending on whether you're listening to this on iTunes or whether you're watching us on YouTube, where you can actually have some facility with these terms and being able to not only understand them, but understand how they may integrate into your very own rig and maybe improve your playing as a consequence of just knowing those terms a little bit better. Might make you play a little bit better and certainly give you a little bit more literacy as you make your way to Tone Town. But before we get started with this conversation, I want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors that makes the Chairman of the Board's podcast possible. And it's none other than the Guitar Sanctuary, which is also coincidentally the home of Brian Omilion. He's actually sitting in the Pedalboard building room inside of the Guitar Sanctuary. But if you go to the Guitar Sanctuary's website, you can see that it is an amazing establishment that not only carries the best gear in the world, but also gear that's made by Grant at Goodwood Audio and me, Mason, at Vertex Effects. You can get any of our products there. And also most of what we will talk about in this episode and many others is all available there. They have a wonderful team, great customer service, and of course, the wonderful Brian Omilion. And if you decide that you want to have your rig built by Brian, you can always have him quote you through the Guitar Sanctuary, where he builds all of his pedal boards exclusively. So check out the Guitar Sanctuary, a wonderful place to buy your gear, great staff, great stuff. We can't say enough good things about them. And without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Grant so we can talk about some of these guitar gear terms and vocabulary so we can just educate ourselves on the way to Tone Town. Grant, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mason. I do have to echo what you just said. Brian truly is wonderful. And just want to, start off the podcast. What better way than just to admit and recognize that Brian is just an all-around awesome guy. And so without further ado, the terms and terminology that I know I have been, and sometimes I'm still like, what are people talking about? And why is this term always being used? And I feel like sometimes it's more of a marketing gimmick rather than trying to be helpful. So let's try and, clear some of these up. One that we actually haven't talked about, we kind of just briefly talked, like what are the terms that come up in emails or questions? One that we didn't bring up at all, which I think was a mistake on my part. I'm going to start us off by blindsiding everyone here a little bit. Amp and cab sim, IRs, profiling, like all in terms of these digital amps. And there's these terms that come along with that. And I know in the beginning, I was like, man, it's a bit hard to keep up. So maybe I'll start off with a little bit of that, and you guys can fill in anything I miss on the amp and cab side of things.
Okay. Let's do it.
But just a brief explanation, amp and cab sim, it's talking about obviously a simulator or a simulated version of a real amp, generally tube amps, trying to sound as close as possible to these as a digital representation. Similarly to maybe like a digital delay, might be trying to replicate an analog tape delay from, early in the 80s or whatever it was. So we're doing the same thing with amps. So amp and cab sim is a full simulation from the input of the amp, preamp section, power amp section, up until the cab itself and miking up a cab. And then you get into more, specific terms like an IR is an impulse response. And that's basically taking the characteristics of just the speakers, the cab, the mic, and the room, but not necessarily the preamp and power amp section of the amp itself. So I know, like, Mason, you recently chatted about the Cab Zeus. And that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it has some basic power amp stuff you can implement into it, but mainly it's all about the cab, the mics, and the room, correct?
Yeah, so I don't think it actually technically has any, or at least not that they're saying explicit power amp simulation. Not like the Cab M is another competitor of it by 2 notes.
Yep.
That's mono. That has explicitly, like, you can choose which power tube you want the power amp to represent. There's nothing like that on the Cab Zeus. It's really more the speaker and the microphones and where they're placed, excuse me, in relativity to the speaker, and then what kind of speaker it is. And they have kind of like, the standard kind of boilerplate speakers, vintage 30s and,
G12
stuff like that,
amps.
greenbacks.
Yep.
Yeah.
But
it's still great. It's still great, but it won't, if you're getting it with the expectation that it's going to replace a whole amp, I don't think that's what their design intent was. I think their intent was like, you take a preamp pedal, and we'll get into those terms too further along, I think. And then you can use that as sort of the second half of the amp. Although again, they're not, if there is some sort of power amp simulation, I would say whatever it is, it's fixed. It's not something that you have control over as a variable.
And this was a mistake I made when the Cab Zeus first came out, which was years ago now. Like, it's been out for a little while. Awesome unit. I, not knowing my terms when this stuff was first coming out, I didn't look at the instructions. I was like, plug it in, see how it sounds. And I was just going for it. And I plugged it in as an amp and cab sim. I did not plug it in as a cab sim. Like, yeah, it's all right, but it didn't blow me away. And then, very quickly realized I was completely approaching it wrong because I didn't understand my terminology. And so amp and cab sim covers the whole thing. Strymon Iridium, ACS1, that's an amp and cab sim. Cab Zeus is a cab simulator, not an amp simulator. So it doesn't take the input and, send out to the cab portion of it. And then we have, profiling. That's another one that comes up. I profiled my amp. That works more with, and you guys can expand on this a little bit.
Kemper
like
and
Kemper.
neural. Yeah.
So you would profile a whole amp from input to speaker, but that is not compatible with Iridium. It's not compatible with ACS1 which those ones are only compatible with IRs or the cabs themselves. So I figured it would be good to get those out of the way. One thing for our listeners as well, which Mason and Brian, I think you can agree, your partners, in my case, my wife, maybe sometimes my friends that aren't guitar players, they love hearing about this stuff. And I think that applies to a whole lot of other terms. Significant others that are not in the music industry, they love talking about profiling. They love talking about IRs.
It's great. Yeah.
It's
totally.
the bread and butter of my conversation. And so I think already you've got some dinner conversation for tonight once you get home. Tell them about what you've learned today in this place on Chairman of the Boards.
Yeah.
So we've talked about...
You want to be guaranteed a kiss at the end of the day.
And
make sure you bring up impulse responses. I'll tell you that right now.
More. Yeah, you might get more than that. So, so we talked about amp and cab sim, IRs, profiling. Brian, what's like the most common term that causes confusion with you and your customers that you'd like to clear up?
Mine would be, as I mentioned earlier, phasing, like polarity phasing, which is a big one because from some venues I played at, or churches, I say venues, churches, I would tell them to flip the phase, and all the front of house guys typically know what that is. And it was always in my ears, and they're like, well, why do you flip the phase? And I was like, oh, well, I can tell the difference if they're out of phase or they're in phase, or if I just like it wider. For me, it's, the way I have been explained, and you guys can even tell me if you've heard it differently. It's like if it's out of phase, the speakers are working in opposite directions. So like pushing out the sound, how like the speaker, if you ever watched a speaker, when playing through your guitar, or you watch, say you have studio monitors and you have the covers off and you can see the speaker moving in and out. On an out of phase amp, if you have two, the speakers will be working in opposite directions. I'm not sure if you guys have heard that term before or not. That's the way I was described it. But there's a just tonally, like, you can feel a little bit difference. Like, they'll feel a little bit wider. Your sound may feel, not as straightforward. But it's talked about in that recent video that you released, Mason, with the client, who talked about how he likes his guitar amps out of phase. So I'm curious for you guys. How do you explain phase?
Take it away, Mason.
Well, so really, I think what most people mean when they say phase is actually polarity. So like that thing that you describe with the speakers moving in different direction, those are the polarities of the speakers are inverted. And so usually when you're running, and this is only applicable, I should say, to multi-amp setups. If you're running mono, we can't make the determination with regard to what's called absolute phase. We can't hear that if we only have one reference. It has to be in reference to another amp in order for us to hear those differences. So we usually, when people are actually saying phase, they mean polarity, and phase is the consequence. Something becomes out of phase as a consequence of the speakers not being in the right polarity, because phase is related to a time delay. And so because those speakers are moving, one's moving forward, one's moving back, it's creating a time delay by the time that the sound the speaker's emitting hits the microphone. And so it creates this delayed sound. And some people do like that, as in the video that we did with Ben Forehand, where he said he likes his amps out of phase because it actually does sound wider. You will lose some bass as a consequence to that. But again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Usually most people would align to them being in the proper polarity. And usually when you're running a multi-amp setup, the way to address it, there's two ways to address it. One way is to have some sort of isolation transformer. So if you had a product like the Goodwood audio interfacer, there's a transformer built into one of the stereo outputs so that you can use that to address the polarity, so that the amps are become in phase, or they're in polarity with each other. The other way to do it is to get a speaker cable that is inverted. So that just means that you take an ordinary speaker cable and you flip or reverse the leads on one side of the speaker cable, and that will also invert the polarity. And so it's another way for you to be able to do this without having to use an isolation transformer. Now, you won't have any of your isolation of the grounds, which is, when you're running multiple amps, you're going to run into some issues with ground loops potentially. So it won't address that. But if you're only trying to address the polarity of the two amps, that's an easy way to do it. Just have an inverted speaker cable. And I know some people that just carry them around because they don't know. It's just not as instantaneous as pushing a button on your interfacer and inverting the polarity and hearing it, working in real time. But yeah, that's usually what I think people mean. There's a lot of confusion between phase and polarity, and generally when people say phase, they actually mean polarity.
Even for Goodwood, I know we started out with phase because it's the one that people most associated and were most familiar with. Yeah. But really, it is polarity. But the industry is it's confusing to know what to use sometimes. Like, do you use the correct term or do you use the one that people tend to understand?
Yeah.
And so, So that's actually a really good one. And even like ground lift, I think, is another term that we can really quickly touch on. And so people will say, like, oh, do you have isolated outputs, or do you have you been able to lift the ground on that amp? And even with that, there's a old school dangerous way of lifting the ground on an amp, which is cutting the ground prong on the power cable. Very dangerous. If your amp shorts or there's an electrical problem, you could get electrocuted. So that's not the best way to do it. But you can lift the ground, and basically you can disconnect the ground between the pedalboard output of the instrument lead on one of your amps and the amp itself. And you can do that with an audio transformer. You can't cut the ground physically with a pair of pliers, but you can use an isolation transformer, and that does it safely. and it gets rid of ground loops. And like, even as we're talking, like, man, there are so many little terms that you just kind of take for granted. But yeah, I think that's another really good thing to be aware of. If you're using multiple outputs, so this doesn't have to be amps, you can run into ground loops, whether it's amp and cab sim, you're using digital outs to a DI, they'll often have a lift on them. And that's essentially doing a very similar thing.
Pardon the interruption, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our amazing sponsors, Pedal Genie. Pedal Genie is like the Netflix of guitar pedals. Basically, you can sign up for their service and get whatever pedals that you want set directly to your door so that you can experiment, try out whatever pedals that you might want, the newest, coolest, latest, and greatest pedals, and you have no obligation to buy them like you would from an ordinary dealership where you'd have to go in, you'd have to buy the pedal, try it out at your home, and then have to worry about getting it back before the return policy expired. There's none of that with Pedal Genie. You simply select the pedals that you want, they send the pedals to your home, you get to check them out with your own gear, and then you can send them back to them when you're ready to try out some new stuff. Really cool system, very simple. And for the first month, listeners get an exclusive Chairman of the Boards discount, which is 50% off your first month using the discount code BOARDS, BOARDS. Gives you 50% off your first month with Pedal Genie. Absolutely amazing service, highly recommended by all of us here at the Chairman of the Boards. And sometimes the ground lift can be done. I mean, you can have an isolation transformer without a ground lift, and you're still going to have an isolated output. Usually, when somebody will add a ground lift, it's usually meaning that, like, on the output jack, they're disconnecting the ground somehow from the case, and that it's becoming now floated. And so there can be various differences even in that. Like for example, on our buffers, that where we have an isolated output, there's no ground lift separately from that. It's like if you're on the isolated output, the benefit of that is like if you really needed that, it's like a Hail Mary situation. So I don't even include them on the isolated output. But I think that if you have like even on SGI, I think there's like a ground lift on some of those. We were talking about that last week.
Yep.
But we spent some time with polarity. We spent some time with one other term that we should talk about maybe just quickly while we're still on this is what a ground loop is, because I think some people I've noticed mix up like what 60 cycle hum is versus ground loops. Like I've had people say, I have this terrible ground loop, and I'll say, well, send me a video of what it is that you mean. Mm-hmm. And they just have a Strat with the volume pot wide open, and what they're hearing is the 60 cycle hum of their guitar. And I say, well, what happens if you turn your guitar volume off? Do you still hear that noise? And it goes away immediately. So I think that there may be confusion between what the difference is of like 60 cycle hum versus a ground loop. Like these are all ways that produce some noise in your system, but the way that they get there are from different reasons, or from different approaches, or different culprits. So maybe we could talk quickly about like the difference between that, what a ground loop is.
Why don't we keep going with that analogy? Let's say I'm Gerald, your customer, asking you some questions here, and I say I have noise in my system. You tell me, turn the volume pot off, like magically fixed. You're like, it's not a ground loop. Well, what is it and how do I fix it? What would your answer be? Or the difference?
Brian, you want to start? Do you want to start with that, Brian?
I mean, a big factor with noise, if you roll back your volume and there's no noise, then it can be pickup related. It depends on your power. At least I go through a checklist in my mind of things like, what is your pedal board plugged into? Is it plugged into lighting? Lighting is a big deal when it comes to pedal boards and guitars. Because if you've ever had a guitar close to your pedal board, you start to put it towards it, it'll start to get noisy, and it's because of everything interfering with each other. But like lighting and whatnot. So I mean, I would say. So I'm getting phone calls. Pickups. I mean, it depends on your pickups, but also depends on what your board is plugged into, that it's not all on one circuit. Yeah. What would you say?
I want to tell you, but first we need to break for a moment and hear a word from our sponsors. All right. So in terms of what I would say, if the guitar volume pot is removing the noise, then it doesn't have anything to do with the pedal board. It would mean that the guitar pickups are responding to, the environment in this, that you can pick up airborne RF and, also you just have inherent 60 cycle hum in any sort of single coil pickup. So, it depends on how livable it is. Like people who know single coil pickups and have used them for a long time, they may have a higher threshold than other people, when they use them. If you find it to be untenable, there's a couple of solutions. You could use noiseless pickups. You could go to a noiseless, or a hum canceling system, like Ilyich or Sir makes a backplate that attaches to your instrument, or in some cases, I think some of the new ones actually go inside of the regular, routing cavity of a Strat, let's say, and will make your regular pickups into noiseless pickups. So there are ways like that to mitigate, but the 60 cycle hum is going to be present if you're using single coil pickups, and that's just kind of what's going to happen. If you are experiencing a ground loop, usually this is a relationship to having multiple different grounding points and it creating a kind of a loop area that where you're having some because you have all these different points where you're connected to ground, it's creating kind of like its own little like feedback loop of ground noise, and hum and this can be, when you're using a stereo setup, this can be using a multiple amp setup. This can even happen sometimes for certain setups when you're using a 4-cable method and you have multiple long cables that are connecting to the effects loop. And you can actually hear the hum change sometimes. And I've done this experiment in certain people's rigs when I'm troubleshooting, where you can move the send and return cables away from each other, and it will change the frequency of the hum. And the closer you get the cables together, when you're not creating, more loop area between the cables, it increases the hum quite a bit. And then you move the send and return cables really close together, and then it gets rid of it. And this is something that can happen in a lot of different setups. It's very common. Usually it's more typical of people that are running multiple amp setups, and, it's all the more reason to make sure that you have high quality isolation transformers and you have isolated outputs for your split mono or your stereo systems, because invariably, maybe in one environment you don't run into it, in another environment you do. And it's one of those things where, you want to be prepared for it. You don't want to have to, be freaking out when you're on your gig and you're about to, you got sound check, in 10 minutes, and then the gig is in another 30 and you don't have a solution for it. So, it's valuable to have that. And there's also individual ground lift devices that you can buy. Like Lely makes a really great one that's passive called the P-Split. And that has an isolation transformer that has a polarity switch and a ground lift on it. And you can plug that, into an amplifier. And it's best to use those, even though in most of the pedal board systems, we're integrating them into the interface boxes, like on our buffer or on Grant's buffer. Technically, they're better or more effective usually to put the isolation transformers close to the input of the amp as possible. So it'll be more effective there. So basically you run your long cable out of, your interface box or out of your stereo pedals into your amplifiers. And on one of the amplifiers, as close to the amplifier as possible, you're going to plug in that long cable into the isolation box, and then a short cable out of the isolation box into the amplifier that you want to isolate. And then you can, eliminate the ground lift from there. So in any case, that long-winded way of talking about it, but I think we have a pretty good understanding, or at least in terms of the terms between some of those things, have to do with polarity, phase, ground lift, 60 cycle hum. What do we want to tackle next? Grant, what do you think?
I've got a couple rapid fire ones for you.
Okay,
about around EQ. So if you could give like a 1-sentence answer for some of these terms, and maybe we could go back and forth between you guys, or take the one that you want to take. But there's a lot of EQ terms that get kind of thrown around when it comes to guitar, especially like a front of house guy will come up and chat to you and say things like, you've got a pretty harsh top end on your guitar right now. What's he actually saying in layman's terms? And I'll go through a few of these. Why don't you start us off, Brian?
My first question to him would be, do I have any EQ on the board? Like, is it flat? So if I have harsh, if my amp or my tone or whatever I'm running, like in my ears doesn't sound harsh, sometimes it can mean it's a front of the house. Is the EQ flat? Do they have any high? Because, they could have used that channel for another whatever gig, and it could have been an acoustic, so they EQ'd the acoustic. But if it's flat EQ, typically that means you have more high end. It's more like, is the word,
what are you hearing?
Brassy, like very I would call it cringy. like very bright.
You have cringeworthy top end.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Well, it's like a Boss DS1. Like it's like a cringe. It's like a very high, bright. It can be a very bright sound. Like there's some.
Hey, now I really like 2K.
No,
you back off 2K.
So I would say it just means you're extremely bright to where it's kind of like there's no bottom end, there's no low end out of it. Like big fat bassy, like plain root notes sounds thin.
Someone's taking a nail file and scraping the inside of your brain.
Pretty much.
You have to kind of like your eyes squint a little bit, and you kind of have to turn away and plug your ears.
Yeah.
What about Mason? Someone saying their sound is very chimey.
Usually I think of that as more of the presence range and less of like the top end range. So, like there's different definitions of where presence starts, but I usually think of it maybe, I don't know, like 5K or something like that. And usually that's kind of like, above the treble range and kind of just gives you like a little sparkle on the top. It doesn't add to maybe the ice picky nature that having a lot of treble content might get you. So I always, my association is always kind of like a Vox style sound. To me, always kind of has that kind of chimey presence.
I personally love the chime.
The Vox has a presence, at least on the Ruby, and even a Vox that has a presence knob. So yeah, I agree. I love.
What about next one? Round. The sound is very round today. What's coming to mind? What do you? I
think like low end or low mids. I usually think of it kind of being more bass heavy.
Bit more of a Fender sound.
Maybe not like flubby, but just like,
There's another term. Why don't you also talk about flubby? What front of house guy says your sound's too flubby? How do you fix it?
Yeah, it's like kind of like, not to use a vocab term with another one, but it's kind of like farting out, or that it kind of, basically you're kind of hearing like kind of like a boominess. Like, right, we're just throwing a bunch of adjectives in here. Like there's kind of like a boominess to the low end that feels like it's uncontrolled, or like it's not, it's not balanced. Yeah. It's overemphasizing the low end.
What about, I'll do one more and then I'll get into some more overdrive ones we might hear. Boxy.
Ugh.
Go for it, Brian.
I would say it would be, boxy to me, it would be like, it's dead sounding. Like it sounds, for me, I would say stale. Basically, it's like you have basically thrown your amp into a wooden it doesn't feel open.
It beat it senseless.
It's just like throwing it in a coffin and shutting the door and just like, it's like, dark. Well, I remember I played somewhere and I played guitar. I was like, ooh, what kind of cabinets are you running? Oh, well, we have ISO boxes. Well, what are they? So they're speaker cabinets in road cases. I'm like, okay, so it's going to be really dead. Do you have a room knob? Do you have something that we can make it sound more lively? And they're like, oh, no, it's very muted. Boxy, for me, I would call a muted amp tone, personally.
I would say something that's really that's got a lot of mid-range. So some people will characterize Tube Screamers as sounding boxy in certain contexts, especially if you maybe overuse the gain knobs. It tends to narrow the bandwidth a lot. So I usually think of it as like something that's got a lot of mid-range that kind of maybe takes away some of the openness, or some of the balance of maybe an amplifier when you step on a pedal that maybe really, goes hard at exaggerating the mid-range.
Okay, two more, and these ones are very much related. Mid-humped or mid-scooped.
Mm-hmm.
This is often referring to overdrives, like I turn on this type of overdrive and it has a big mid-hump in it. What are people practically saying?
Sorry for the interruption, folks, but I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about one of our amazing sponsors, Creation Music Company. Not only do they make amazing, beautiful pedal boards, but they also have started making their own quarter-inch plugs and used exclusively by Brian Omilion of Omilion Audio. They have their mini cakes, which are low-profile pancake plugs, as well as short, straight plugs that really compete with any of the greatest and lowest profile short plugs out there. Great for pedal board switchers. And again, that's why guys like Brian Omilion use these plugs exclusively. And listeners get a special discount code. Using the code Chairmen15 is going to give you 15% off anything in the Creation website. You can get that discount, get whatever you need for your next pedal board, a pedal board surface, your plugs, whatever you're going to need to build the pedal board of your dreams. Creation is going to be able to help you do that. Head over to their website. That's going to be listed in the show notes, as well as the description if you're watching on YouTube. Creation Music Company, absolutely amazing stuff. Highly recommended by the chairman of the boards. Well, if you're looking at an EQ curve, the hump would look like a frown, and the scoop would look like a smiley face.
The scoop is obviously better.
Because it's happier. It's definitely happier. So, reference points, not to go back to the Tube Screamer, but the Tube Screamer's got a real mid hump. So, we could say, forget what the exact range of the Tube Screamers, but I usually think of like, somewhere between, 5 or 600K to maybe 1.6K or something like that as kind of being in that mid-range zone where you would get kind of where if it's really boosted there, you're going to have the mid hump, and then the scooped mid is going to be kind of more of like, I don't know, the sound of a classic Fender amp. Doesn't have a lot of mid-range. It's got, a scoop sound. It can be very chime. It's great for cleans. It tends not to be as great for cutting through a mix. When you're talking about a more scooped out mid-range, it's harder to get, really through, but it can be a really beautiful sound for cleans. And again, that's kind of been the classic mid-60s Fender black panel sound is all very mid-scooped. By contrast, like a Tube Screamer is really kind of mid-range heavy, and has that more of that mid-hump thing that some people might refer to as honky or boxy.
Honky, that's a good one. Not necessarily a derogatory term. Speaking of a person, honky could be referring to EQ. And I will say one of the best things, if you've never done this, whoever's listening to this, if you have a front of house sound engineer that is decently good at what they do, you will gain back your time 100-fold if you spend 10 minutes with them on a recorded loop of your guitar or of even an MP3. And just tell them like, okay, what's a honky sound? What's a box sound? What's a mid-scooped sound? And just get them to go through and practically show you so you can take a listen. It is so valuable because next time you hear your guitar and it's just not quite there, you're able to put some terms to it and hopefully some practical outworking of how to fix it. It's very valuable. Mason, you're cracking up over there, man. What did I say?
Oh, I remember once like doing that with somebody, and I was like, like I want my deluxe sound, but I want some Voxy chime on the top, and I think that he thought I was saying Voxy chime, and so he he added a lot of presence and a lot of mid range.
Yeah,
but like
Voxy
everything,
chime.
Boxy chime. Yeah.
My gosh.
Is that a sound that's capable on your new amp that you recently posted about this week?
Chime for sure. I mean, the accent control is basically a presence control, which is like, in my opinion, like the most important knob on the amp as far as the EQ is concerned.
Yep.
As far as it getting boxy, no, not really. I mean, I try to make it so it was hard to dial in a bad sound out of it. But, I guess if you really crank the mid-range and you took the treble and bass controls down way low, it probably wouldn't sound that good. I mean, it wouldn't be
which is actually a good thing to bring out. Like typically boxy is not a good thing. Not all these terms we're talking about are negatives. They're just terms that get thrown around. Boxy is typically not a sound you want.
Generally boxies, you don't want to put your tone in a corner.
One last one that just popped into mind is people say, I'd like a bit more room in my sound. What are they saying?
Well, for me, if it's room, I would describe it as more making your amp sound more lively. So if you have like the Iridium, or like for my aux, or any of these other ACS ones, anything that has like a room knob on it, if you do the test by turning the room knob all the way off, it sounds super dead. It sounds just amp in a box,
like you're in a TV studio,
as isolated as possible. And then you start turning up the room knob and you start to feel, oh, okay, it feels like it's sitting right next to me. Like I kid you not, the first time I played the Iridium, I had it all the way off and I was like, this sucks. I don't like this. I'm not like, I don't like how it sounds. It's too boxy. And I was like, well, what's the room knob? Thinking it's just like reverb. So I started turning it up and I think I got it around 1 o'clock and I literally thought it was right next to me. It felt next to me, even though I had headphones on. There's just some,
but it was next to you, wasn't it?
It was literally.
Yeah, okay. Just make sure.
Yeah. No, the radio. No, radio. Yeah, no, on the board. But like it felt like a real amp was there because it felt more open. It's basically as if like you had your amp in an open room with a couple mics on it and it had room to breathe, rather than throwing it in a suffocated little box and expecting great tone.
And some people will do this even on some of the digital recreations of a room in like amp and cab sim software. Getting a bit more room, you can literally in the software, you can pull the mic back off the speaker and you'll start hearing, a bit more of the reflections, and you'll start hearing a bit, like Brian just said, it's a bit more lively. Again, it's not good or bad necessarily, but adding in a bit of room, a bit more of the characteristics of that room rather than close miking, is something that you can also experiment. You can also experiment with this on a real amp, especially if you have in-ears, and you can pull the mic, just as an experiment, pull the mic 10 feet off the amp and see what it sounds like in comparison to pulling it, 6 inches away from the speaker or the dust cap or anything like that. Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Brian. Mason, you had mentioned before the podcast when we were chatting, true bypass, DSP bypass, mechanical switching. Do you want to kind of touch on some of these terms that definitely have confused me in the past?
I would love to talk to you about all the forms of bypass. But before we do that, I would like to break for a quick word from our sponsors. All right. So bypasses. There are a lot of different terms that indicate what type of bypass your pedal may have. I think that the broad category distinctions are typically true bypass or buffered bypass. And so just to start with those broad terms, true bypass in whatever form it takes, and we'll dive into the different forms, generally is considered that the input is connected to the output in bypassing the circuitry of the pedal. And this is done passively, so you don't need to have any power, at least when you're using a mechanical switch, in order for the input jack to pass directly to the output jack if the pedal is powered off. There's no active circuitry when the pedal is in bypass. The circuit is completely disconnected from the input and output jack, and it's as though you just wired a cable from the input to the output jack. True bypass when it's off, it's completely bypassed from the circuit. Guitar is just passing right through it, just like a cable. And then when you activate it, then the circuit is then brought in. This is opposed to buffered bypass, where there is always some active circuitry that's going on in the pedal. And in some cases, this could be like on a Boss pedal, there are 2 buffers at minimum on every pedal. There's one on the front that's a JFET style buffer, and then on the output there is a BJT style buffer. So you have 2 buffers on every Boss pedal one on the input and one on the output, and those are always there whether the circuit is brought in or not. So the foot switch is only bringing in the actual like circuit of the distortion pedal or the delay pedal or whatever the design of the pedal is. The input and output buffer in there are always active all the time. And this is pretty consistent with most buffered bypass pedals. They have some sort of signal conditioning that's running in the circuit all the time, whether the pedal be on or off. And then the foot switch is just simply engaging the effect of the pedal, but the state of the buffer is always the same. So it's always buffered all the time, whether the pedal is on or off. So those are sort of the broad categories. Now, within that, there are various subtypes of true bypass. You'll hear people sometimes call it mechanical bypass, which is usually indicating that it's just true bypass using a mechanical switch, which are the switches that you can hear kind of like click when you push them all the way down and depress the foot switch fully. And that's because it's a butt contact switch and it's switching over its state. Go ahead, Rant. Oh yeah, you can hear a little click there.
Bring it a little closer to the mic.
Oh man.
ASMR,
Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah, I'm about to say.
Okay, everyone quiet.
It's too quiet.
It's too quiet.
Oh, really? In my ears, it's just going to
No,
town.
really?
Like that's as mechanical as it gets.
Maybe in your mic it'll pick it up a little bit better.
I hope so.
But in any case, so those are 3-pole double throw switches. They also have 4-pole double throw switches if you have like a stereo pedal or something like that. And these are mechanical switches, but contact switches is another way that they've been called. And you know, it mechanically is switching the state of the pedal. This is opposed to a relay true bypass where you're using, you know, some sort of momentary switch, and it is switching a relay, which is performing the functions that the mechanical switch formerly did, all in one package. So you're creating basically a circuit that the foot switch is now sort of ornamental and is just changing the state of a relay that's doing all of the internal switching that formerly the mechanical switch did. And a lot of people believe that the soft switches are somehow superior because they don't make the same noise. Now, I will say that mechanical foot switches, like the 3-pole double throw or 4-pole double throw that we talked about before, there is like a noise that you can hear when you step on them, and it's just part of the switch. Now, that's usually, if the circuit is designed well, not audible in your amplifier. However, there are some designs that are not taking into account this switch, and you can get some popping sounds through the amplifier as a consequence of changing the state of the circuit, especially on a true bypass circuit where there isn't continuous signal always running through the pedal. And this is not something that is inherent in a 3-pole double throw or 4-pole double throw mechanical switch. This is something to do with the way that it's designed. And a lot of people that converted, let's say, a 3-pole double throw switch design to a clickless or a soft touch true bypass, they're generally actually not solving the problem. A lot of times what those relays do is they have a time delay in them. And so even when you hit the foot switch, there isn't an immediate transition of the signal into the signal path once you hit it. There's usually a short delay because what it's doing is it's just charging that pop sound, and then it's bringing in the actual signal. So a lot of times people will say, oh, it's so great, fill in the blank company, they switched over to, you know, clickless true bypass. Everybody should do this because it solved all the popping problems that their pedals formerly had. And it's like, actually it didn't. They still have the same popping problems they always had. It's just that when you switch to a relay true bypass, you can discharge that audio signal for a few milliseconds. So then when the audio signal comes in, you don't have that big old sound that it had before. This is a design problem, not something that's rectified by a soft touch true bypass. But those are just a few of the general terms that are around it. Brian, do you have something to add to that? Sorry for the interruption, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about one of our incredible sponsors, Bestronix, also known as BTPA, an amazing company out of Chicago, Illinois. Now, most of us at the Chairmen of the Boards get a lot of our materials that we build our pedal boards with, whether that be cable, whether that be for audio, whether that be for power, whether that be connectors like 1/4-inch connectors or 2.1 millimeter barrel connectors for power. All the supplies that you could possibly need to build the pedal board of your dreams is available at Bestronix. They have amazing, amazing selections, all the cables that you could possibly want, whether it's Mogami, whether it's Evidence, whatever it may be. They have every single brand conceivable, in addition to their own brand, their in-house brand, which is absolutely incredible sounding, super low capacitance, and competes with all the best stuff, whether it be Mogami, Canary, Belden, etc. They have a great in-house brand, highly recommended, and listeners get a special discount using the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, just like the old show on Saturday Night Live where they talked about Da Bears being from Chicago, as Bestronix are. You can use the coupon code DACHAIRS and you can get 10% off anything in the entire store. Absolutely amazing way to save some dough, get some great materials from some great people. Bestronix, absolutely amazing company, highly recommended by the chairman of the boards.
I don't. Man, you honestly just covered that. I would say it's a pretty big, as we talked about prior, why this was brought up is that exact reason, is that I'm trying to gather my thoughts, so I'm sorry. Is that a lot of people are like, man, you said everything. I just wanted to emphasize, like, when you say something is noisy, it doesn't mean that like the pedal is physically noisy. It may be the clicking. So like I played some more like, oh yeah, you were really noisy while this person was talking. And I was like, I wasn't really talking. They're like, oh well, it's the stomping that you're doing, the clicking. Oh, you mean my switch is clicking? Oh, okay. Like, so there's like different people are like, oh well, the oversight of this church said I was too loud when I was stepping on pedals. I'm like, okay, well then you could get, a relay switch, like a soft switcher to put them in, that kind of stuff. So no, Mason said everything.
And I will say as well, even with a clickless system or a click stop, like even in the RJM PBC10, there's a click stop option you can turn on and off. That is, like Mason was saying, is put there to make up for potentially poor designs or maybe some older pedals that are leaking DC into your system, and you switch with a hard switch or even a soft switch and you'll hear that audible pop. But a click stop is generally adding a like transistor circuit. There might be other ways to doing it that is permanently in your signal chain. So you're adding more circuitry into your signal chain to make up for poor designs that came before that spot in your system in the past. So a click stop can be very helpful depending on the gear you have on your board, but it's not necessarily the perfect solution. As with most things in guitar rigs, there's give and take and pros and cons. But if you do have a loud pop, a click stop can be a huge, huge blessing. It can really save the day in a lot of ways if you aren't willing to change out some of the pedals on your rig. Brian, if there was, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. If there was one term, and Mason, maybe you can have a think about this as well. If there was one term that you wish every guitar player just inherently understood, you didn't get questions about it anymore, people got it, what would be the term that came to mind? Like, please just understand this one thing. What would it be? Whether it's to do with pedal board setups, pedals, signal chain, guitars, is there one term that you wish was fixed? Understood by all?
when I post a photo of a rig that I just did with all the specs and they still ask you the question of the board, that's not the same thing. It's not your answer. It's not the question you asked. It would be, that's the thing, is that there's
Mason, while he thinks, do you got one that you...
I'm sorry. Yeah, I got to think on this one.
I told you, man. I put you on the spot. You never know what's going to happen on Chairman of the Boards. And, we'll just see.
Yeah, no,
we'll
my first answer... Yeah. My first answer would have been what I jokingly just said, because that's how I actually feel, but that's a different subject.
What about you, Mason?
I would say that the misuse of the word preamp is something that I think is one of the things that is obviously it's not, I don't know that it's hurting anybody, but it certainly, I feel like his is getting applied to seemingly any distortion, overdrive,
Everything's a preamp.
or boost is now a preamp, and this term is just being used, everywhere. And I think to the point where it's almost sloppy to me. Because when I think of a true preamp in the way that it may have been described in classic guitar rigs, it's like, if you bought a preamp for your rack rig, it was essentially, the preamp section of an amplifier, basically everything from the input jack of an amplifier up to the effects send, which is the preamp output. That would be what a preamp is. Now, people started making pedals that were, designed to be sort of solid state or even tube versions of a preamp section of an amplifier. One such company that I can think of that was doing this really early on. Yeah, Kingsley has been a company that's done that. ADA also had made, let's say preamp sections out of their MP1 rack unit in a pedal format. And it had a 12X7 tube and all that stuff. And that was a true preamp. But then you'll see companies that just have an overdrive pedal, and they've somehow started calling it a preamp, as though it could somehow substitute, if you plugged into that pedal directly and plugged it into the effects return or into a power amp, that it would somehow work in place of an amplifier preamp. Like a even better version of this would be the Synergy modules, where those are kind of like rack mount systems that have module preamps and then a fixed power amp. Those are like full like tube amp preamps that are in modules. They're not in a pedal format, but somehow people are equating their solid state distortion pedal to be the same as something like that. And it's just not even the same. And so I feel like this term is getting applied to just anything that produces distortion. Like I got a new overdrive pedal, but instead of calling it an overdrive, I'm going to call it a preamp, because that is a pod sweetener that the marketplace is going to really love. And it's going to sound like it's more amp-like if I call it a preamp as opposed to an overdrive. So, maybe this is a little bit of get off my lawn, and I'm, and I'm just this old grumpy chairman of the board. But I don't know. I feel like it's getting misapplied, and I think it's creating confusion, because I think that some people think like, I got the amp sound right here because I got a preamp,
So what would be the key difference? And this would help me as well. What would be the key difference in your mind between a preamp and an overdrive? At what point does an overdrive become a preamp, or is that never the case? And at what point does a preamp become an overdrive? Can they ever be interchangeable? How do I recognize as a consumer the difference?
Brian, do you want to start?
Yes. Let me just gather. I'm still thinking on my.
Okay.
No, you're good. No, I'm good. I'm doing two things. I would say the difference between a preamp and an overdrive. That was the question, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Is that an overdrive where, first off, you can run Prism, RC Booster. A lot of these things that people have labeled preamp first in the chain pedals can be used as overdrives. So any overdrive can be, a tube screamer could be ran first in the chain, gain all the way down, really clean to give you that preamp tone. I don't know. I can't say that there is a hard definition difference. They both can really gain up volume. I would say a preamp, maybe you have a little bit more EQ option. Personally, that's how I would define it. What would you say, Mason?
Well, I think that the distinction is kind of muddled, right? Like and even just in your description of it being like the idea of it being first in the chain is like a qualifier. Like I don't even know that I like are they saying preamp in that like it's replacing what would formerly have been in like an active guitar, like a preamp inside a guitar. which is essentially like a buffer circuit, right? So like, is having an input buffer now like a preamp? Like the definition to me just seems like so wide, and I feel like in the context of electric guitar, and you're talking about a preamp, I'm immediately thinking of the first half of your tube amplifier, and so it's emulating what a tube amplifier preamp section could do in the context of your pedal board. And in that sense, any pedal that's coming before the amplifier power amp section, I guess technically could be considered a preamp, but I don't know that to me, the distinction sort of got overlaid with something that sounded amp-like and became just another euphemism for something that had an amp-like quality to it, was now considered a preamp. So if you were doing a Marshall-y style overdrive, instead of calling it, a Marshall in a box, now it's a British preamp. And this could just be, a marketing strategy that's connected with people to make them feel as though they've gotten a closer semblance to an authentic amp tone out of a solid state overdrive. Because it doesn't sound as sexy to call it a solid state overdrive as it does to call it a British inspired preamp. And so maybe this is where we are. I don't know. This is the term of the decade.
Well, I would say, like, I would say, I don't know, of every 10 builds I do, 9 of them, they're like, oh yeah, I want a preamp pedal, burst in the chain. And I'm like, okay, well, how are you using it? Well, it's always on, and I kind of just adjust the tone of it, or like the tone knob. I'm like, okay, so you're using it as a shaper. I think that's another one, is that the term preamp pedal has been has been labeled first in the chain, always on, and you adjust. I use an RC booster like that, but I don't call it a preamp pedal. I call it a shaper or an EQ, because I'm shaping my tonal input differently on my Falcon than I am on my dual jet. So I think that is also another misconception of it, is that people say preamp as so easily, like you just said, marketing strategy.
Yeah, because really, it's okay if they're just an overdrive or they're just a distortion pedal. Some of the best pedals ever made didn't resort to calling themselves preamps.
No, I've had guys like, oh yeah, I run a Timmy first as my preamp, but it's an overdrive. But don't tell anyone. I'm like, this is
secret safe.
Fine. It's fine. Like, fine.
I think that it's probably all semantics, and we're just getting. I speak for myself. I'm just getting grumpy about this.
No, I'm
this is a safe place.
I'm sorry.
Safe place.
Sorry for the interruption, guys, but I wanted to take a moment to talk to you about one of the sponsors of the show, the Guitar Sanctuary. Now, Guitar Sanctuary is not only the place where Brian Omilion is housed and builds all of his spectacular pedal boards, it's also one of the flagship dealerships in all of the United States. They carry Vertex products, they carry Goodwood products, and pretty much any major brand or boutique brand you can think of is available there, whether it's a guitar, amplifier, or guitar pedals. They have it all. Absolutely amazing shop. Great service, great staff, knowledgeable people, just like Brian Omilion. And furthermore, if you want to have a rig built, you can hire Brian Omilion through the Guitar Sanctuary to build the rig of your dreams. So many different options there, having all the pedals and everything you might need under one roof, and having a guy like Brian Omilion build your pedal board. It is a match made in heaven. Definitely check out the Guitar Sanctuary. It will be linked in the show notes and in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Absolutely amazing store, highly recommended by the chairman of the boards.
I would say this is more of one just because I feel this question so often. I get a lot of messages through Instagram of just all sorts of questions, which is great. I like answering them. But the most common question I get is, why can't I run my Morningstar MC6? Great controller. Why can't I run my analog pedal into it? Why do I need to buy a secondary device like an ML5 or the new 10 or the disaster TPC micro? And I'm like, well, because it's a MIDI controller. I'm like, what's a MIDI controller? Well, it's a controller that controls the MIDI only. And people are like, oh, so it doesn't do analog loops? I'm like, no, well, that's a switcher that has analog and MIDI capabilities like Musicom, Gigrig, RJM, all these other companies and whatnot. So I think that was one people immediately hear MIDI switcher and they automatically go, oh, well, I can do all my analog loops. And then they have that rude awakening that they have to go buy a 500 piece, $500 item to do all their analog loops.
Which is really good to point out. Like a MIDI controller doesn't create sound. It can only manipulate another device that creates sound. So a MIDI controller can't actually turn audio on and off, but it can talk to a pedal and tell that pedal to turn on and off, or tell that pedal to move this knob digitally.
Yeah.
And so that is actually a really good point, the MIDI side of things versus a MIDI controller with loops or two bypass loops or whatever you want to call it, MIDI controller and switcher all in one. And we've chatted about this in previous episodes, but yeah, that's a really good one. What about on the last one, Mason? I know we're coming up towards the end of the podcast here, but again, one that in the past I've been confused about. And so I'm just airing all my confusion on this podcast and selfishly trying to become more educated here, stealing all your knowledge. The difference between gain type terms, distortion, overdrive, fuzz. We've obviously talked a little bit about preamp, boost, and then clipping. Someone says, oh, this one can do asymmetrical and symmetrical clipping, or diode or whatnot. Again, we could talk about this for the next hour, but really briefly, difference between different gain types and terms and clipping types. What would you say on a couple minute overview?
Yeah, so I think that the main thing to understand is it's all distortion, right? Like in terms of the way that you would look at it on instruments, you would see all this stuff as distortion, whether you're talking about fuzz or whether you're talking about overdrive or just or straight ahead distortion pedals. And so we've sort of categorized or subcategorized distortion into different categories, sort of depending on the severity of the distortion. Fuzz being the most extreme version of it, and overdrive being maybe the more mild of it, and then kind of distortion being somewhere in between. And then you kind of get into these terms like hard clipping, soft clipping, or asymmetrical clipping being associated with the hard clipping, and symmetrical being with the soft clipping. And so you get stuff like a rat is kind of considered a distortion pedal, the type of clipping that it provides, the amount of gain that it has, that kind of gets roped into the distortion category, where a blues breaker, which is, softer clipping, gets kind of set into this more overdrive category. But you can even see variations on the same circuit where you'll have, the same exact circuit, but one with symmetrical and the other with an asymmetrical clipping. So like the Boss SD1 versus the Tube Screamer, they're basically the same circuit, but the Boss version, has a asymmetrical clipping, and then the Tube Screamer has more symmetrical. And you'll hear the difference between those two to kind of synthesize. The Boss will have maybe a little bit more aggressive distortion. It'll sound a little bit more in your face, a little bit more I'm trying to think of like a better adjective to use that doesn't just put us right back in the same.
A further trip away from your clean tone, whereas the soft clipping is a bit closer to the original clean tone.
It's definitely going to be mellower and have less of an edge. The asymmetrical is going to have more of a hard edge, and some people really like that sound. They really want to have a little bit more edgier breakup sound, and then some people want more of a smooth, kind of mellower sort of breakup sound. And so you can kind of choose what you want based on the type of clipping that you desire, or it's sometimes nice to have both. There's some pedals, have a switch, especially like Tube Screamer replicas will often have switches where you can switch it to an asymmetrical clipping versus a symmetrical. So you can switch between basically an SD1 and a TS9, in the same pedal, depending on, what setting you want. But I think that the main thing is not really to get too hung up on the distinctions. I think that basically, I think you just think of it all as distortion, and you have varying grades of it. And depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve, you will go for a higher or lower gain sound in order to achieve it. And I think fuzz is kind of a standalone category in that, not only are there these distortion categories to think about, but then there's also this other word, impedance. And when you have an effect that's impedance sensitive, like a fuzz, you now have to not only be concerned about when you use it, but where you use it, because if something is impedance sensitive, that means where it's placed in relativity to the guitar and other pedals are going to influence the way that it sounds. And so something that's really high impedance, I think the best way to need another vocabulary word here as we kind of complete is, I think the easiest way to understand something when you're talking about impedance is how sensitive is it to the external world, the external environment that it's in. If it's really high impedance, means it's sensitive to everything. So, if you put, a fuzz after a buffer, it's going to really diminish the qualities of the fuzz because it's very high impedance. It doesn't like to see anything but the direct guitar pickups connected to it. Whereas something that's low impedance, like let's say a Goodwood audio interface or buffer or a Vertex buffer, these are not sensitive to anything because they're low impedance, and so they tend to have very little variability irrespective of the environment that they're in because they're very, very low impedance, not sensitive, the opposite side of the spectrum from a fuzz. So you have a high impedance circuit, very sensitive to everything. You have to be very conscientious of where it goes and how it's used. Low impedance circuit doesn't really care where it's used. Now, maybe, there'll be preferences as far as where you put it in the signal path location and things like that. You wouldn't want to use your buffer in a suboptimal place. You generally want to use them first and last, pending that you have a fuzz, or pending that you don't have a fuzz. You would use them first and last. If you did, you'd put a fuzz before the input buffer. But those are not going to be sensitive to the external world in terms of their ability to be able to do their jobs and driving a low output impedance signal to whatever it is that it's driving. So we got a 2-for-1 there. We got to talk about distortion and we got to talk about impedance. Is there any? Sorry, go ahead, Grant.
2 quick thoughts here. One correction on what you just said, Mason. I have decided now to change it to the interface or preamp. It's going to be the new name of the pedal.
My mistake.
Just made that decision since preamp is the new cool term. So now I have the interface or preamps on the input and output of your pedal board.
Yeah.
Secondly, thanks for covering impedance because that's actually a really good one. The last thing I think we need to do as the chairman of the boards, we need to come up with a quiz. And it's basically what distortion are you? I personally, and I mean this in all seriousness, but kind of joking, I would be a fuzz pedal. I'm a sensitive dude. And, but other people out there, they're a boost, they don't care about the outside world and they're impervious to other people's opinions and thoughts. And they just, keep trucking along. So maybe coming in early 2023, what distortion are you? The quiz by Chairman of the Boards. I'm personally looking forward to it. I don't know how you guys feel.
We need that one of those apps where you hold it up, to your face and it spins through all these pedals.
Yeah, that'd be a good thing.
I'm just saying I would be a noise gate because I don't do a whole lot of talking, so I'm very silent.
When you do talk, people hear you, and then you're happy with silence as well.
Exactly,
yeah,
pretty much.
I like it, man. I like it. So keep an eye out for that.
Right.
Any last thoughts on terms? I know, we're not going to be able to cover everything. The industry is vast and wide, but any last terms you'd like as takeaways or final thoughts?
I do have one that I've been wanting to say. This is a term that I have had a lot of, is that and I'll be really brief because we're getting close to the end, is expression over MIDI, the term.
Nice.
Because I said MIDI over expression to one person and they're like, that's the wrong term. I was like, yeah, so I said it backwards. Sorry, my bad. And a lot of people don't understand that. Like MIDI, you're sending, PCs, which are preset changes, or CCs, which are control changes. So you're sending values and numbers to do certain pedals. Like I have a whole Chase Bliss board. I'm going to do 34 by 16 for this guy. Has a RJM GT 16, an autotone, CXM, and all chase-less pedals, but there's no analog switcher. Everything is going to be controlled via CC messages, expression, everything. So I think a lot of people will be like, "Oh, I didn't understand that I could plug in my expression pedal into, say, an RJM or a Musicom or something, and I could actually program certain expression effects on certain pedals just with that on the controller." I thought I had to individually plug in, because I've had people that actually have a TRS cable and they'll move the cable around to different effects that they want to use, or they'll use like the Mission, this Mission Expressinator. Yes, yeah. Which is a great pedal. It's a great little box if you need it. This one board I'm doing, he has it on the board, but he has a PVC6. So I think there's terms of when you hear MIDI or expression over MIDI, if you think about it as the most simplest terms, is you're sending an expression signal to the controller, and then the controller is sending values to that MIDI pedal. Disregard this if it has to do with an analog pedal, because those are completely different. But I think that was one term that I've had people go, I don't quite understand that. And I was like, okay, well, it's actually really, it's a lot more simpler. People, I think, get MIDI really like, they start diving down the rabbit hole because it can do so much stuff. When really MIDI is, sending numbers. Controller's just going to do what you want. So that was my final thought terms.
Fun little life hack for the Expressionator as well. I just have to say, this will be my final thing. I've done this on a couple of rigs where you send one output of the Expressionator to your MIDI controller, and the other two outputs can be sent to analog pedals that don't have MIDI. So you can't, but they do have expression jacks, like a EHX Pitchfork. And you can, with the Expressionator, use that to control multiple different types of expression. Very cool unit. Lots of flexibility.
Yeah. That's actually what I'm doing on this one. That's,
nice.
Exactly what we're doing, which is a really smart way of doing it.
Yep. Love it. Mason, any final thoughts, terms?
I have one final one. But before I go into it, I want to do just another quick break to talk about one of our amazing sponsors. So hold on for that. All right. So the last one that I wanted to mention was voltage versus current. And this is a question that I get asked a lot in maybe misunderstanding. So some people will say, will misunderstand if they say have a 9 volt and an 18 volt pedal, and they want them to share the same output by using, I don't know, some sort of splitter cable, right? And they only have a 9 volt output. Okay, will it be able to work with these two pedals? And of course the answer is no. I think that what ends up happening a lot of times is people will see things like current and they'll collapse it with the voltage. They're very different terms. Basically, the current is talking about how much of the available 18 volts that output, let's say, provides, is the pedal going to draw of the allotment that is there. So you have a voltage that has to meet whatever the standard of the pedal is. If it's 18 volts, you need an 18 volt power supply. Then the next critical thing is, do you have enough current at 18 volts to actually operate the pedal in its operable range? And I think that some people will look at the current and they'll think, well, I need to match the current of the pedal to the power supply. And that is true to only up to the point that you have at least the amount that the pedal draws. So if the pedal draws 100 milliamps at 18 volts, you need the output to at least produce 100 milliamps at 18 volts. It could produce more milliamps, but it can't produce more voltage. And I think that some people get that confused, where they're like, well, I guess if I went up to 24 volts, then that's okay. I just need to have at least 18 volts. And it's like, no, voltage needs to match no matter what the pedal is. If it's 18 volts, it needs to be 18 volts. If it's 9 volts, it needs to be 9 volts. The current, however, can be greater than the amount of current that the pedal requires. The pedal is only going to draw from that current the amount that it needs, but there can't be less available current than what the pedal is going to draw. So in other words, if you have a 500 milliamp 18 volt pedal you can't use 100 milliamp output at 18 volts on your power supply. There's not enough current supply in order to power the pedal at that voltage. So I think that these are just things to understand, is that current and voltage are separate. Voltage needs to match 1-to-1. 9 volts needs to be paired with a 9-volt output. Current, however, you can have a greater amount of current than the amount that the pedal needs, but you can't have less current than the pedal needs. And if you're ever wondering what the current draws are of your pedals, most of your manufacturers should have this information included in your manual. And if you don't know, there's a great tool that's made by True Tone, and I bet it's sold at the Guitar Sanctuary, which is a current reader where you can basically plug in any pedal into this and it will tell you how much current it's drawing. And so it's a great tool to use if you're not sure what the current requirements are of your particular pedal. This will tell you exactly what it draws, and so you have a clear understanding of exactly what your needs are going to be from your power supply. So you make sure you have enough current at that voltage to power the pedals that you want. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
There's an analogy for this, which I think is helpful. If your power supply one outlet is a garden hose, voltage is the size of the garden hose, and current is the amount of pressure capable. So the size needs to be exact, 9 volt to a 9 volt pedal. And then you can supply more pressure, but it won't necessarily use everything that you supply to it, being the current. Yeah, that's great. That's actually a really good term. I didn't even consider that, but that does come up quite a bit. Voltage and current. All
right.
That's it for me, guys. I don't think I have anything else to add.
Well, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other stuff too. Like if you're watching this, and if you haven't already been going along, if you're watching this live streamed in the chat, plugging in different terms or things that we should be covering. This could always, evolve into another episode in the future. More guitar vocabulary terms explained. So please do make sure that if you're watching this on YouTube, that you're putting stuff in the comments or you're making requests for other stuff. And Grant, you have another aside.
This is very important. Very important. It relates to an off-the-cuff hashtag. I think we need to hashtag Tonetown.
Yes.
I would love to see, and this is hashtag with this clip if you dare. I would love to see people hashtag Tonetown with videos of them talking about today with their significant other and the reaction that they get. Because I think,
oh my gosh.
Actually, I know it's going to be positive, and I know you're going to thank me for it later. So take a 10-second video of you talking to your significant other who knows nothing about the music industry, perhaps, and talk to them about true bypass versus buffer bypass versus DSP, current, voltage, and just let us know what their reaction is. And I think I would very much be willing to repost that on my channel because I think it's just going to really help some people. So that's my challenge to you guys.
I'm thinking of my friend Buddy Blues. Buddy Blues is going to talk to his wife about this. Buddy Blues is the challenge.
Perfect.
This is like a hidden camera challenge. That's amazing. I'm so excited.
That's all. Yes. I really want to mention that before we close this out.
I think it's all great. And before we complete it, I just want to give just one more shout out to our sponsors, the Guitar Sanctuary, for making the podcast possible. Pedal Genie. You can get 50% off your first month if you want to try out Pedal Genie again using the code BOARD, BOARD, 50% off your first month. Bestronix, where many of us get all of our cables and supplies. I get all of my plugs, connectors, whether it's DC, audio, whatever it is, from Bestronix. Again, they have 10% off for all Chairman of the Board's listeners using the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS. And lastly, Creation Music Company, 15% off anything from their store that is not a custom-made item like a specialty wood or something like that. Anything that's regularly on their store, 15% off. And again, those are all the plugs that Brian uses on all of his switcher rigs, all of his pedalboard rigs. He's almost exclusively using only the mini cakes and the Creation mini straight plugs. You can get 15% off using the code Chairman15, anything from Creation Music Company's website. So definitely do check out those sponsors. Again, by you supporting them, checking out their website, buying a few things from them, that tells them that you're listening, that you're supporting us as a byproduct of that. So just please do make sure, if you're in the market for any of those supplies, those materials, you want to try out some pedals, please do check out our sponsors. They really are making this podcast possible every single week. Any final thoughts, final words before we close out, gents?
I'm happy.
All right. Until next week, we'll see you further down the road to Tone Town.
See ya.
See ya.